Hello out there, good people of Lockdown Land. I hope you're good. Welcome to episode 19 of The Spirit Box. This week we welcome Morgan Daimler. Morgan is really an authority on fairy lore, and a huge pleasure for me to have on the show. She really joined an awful lot of dots for me. So Morgan's been a practicing witch since the 1990s and studying Irish folklore mythology since the mid-90s. And growing up around the Irish-American diaspora really contributed to this interest, which also came to include Celtic language-speaking cultures such as Scottish, Welsh, and eventually the more loosely connected Norse, with obviously a focus around fairies. So Morgan's been teaching and writing about fairies since the early 2000s and has presented workshops on related topics in the US, Ireland, as well as presenting as an independent scholar at the University of Ohio's Fairies and the Fantastic Conference in 2019. So absolute pleasure to have on the show for me personally, because she really joined an awful, as I said earlier, she really put together a lot of different concepts that I wasn't aware of were part of fairy lore, things like fairy lovers, fairy possession. You'll hear in the show. It's stay tuned, it's a good one. In terms of the show, if you're watching on YouTube, these are all my photographs of Ireland. I might as well big up my homeland. Right, that's enough for me. On with the show. Morgan Daimler, you're very welcome to Spirit Box.
I'm very thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to have you on board. We were just chatting beforehand at giving a shout out to Lonnie Scott, who really is the reason we're both having this chat. As he pointed me your way, he said, well, with the gin stuff you're doing, you should really have a chat to Morgan about her work with fairies. And so here we are. And thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. So I think to help orientate people, I've got a list of a couple of talking points here, but to help orientate people, I see you use the expression the denouement to describe fairies. And for some of our listeners who say wouldn't be particularly familiar with that expression and the reasons behind that expression, would you take us through that?
Sure. Yep, I use Thina Ma, Thina Ella, Thina Ushla, which is in order good people, other people, noble people, although I think that gets translated more usually as like the gentry.
Right.
And those are all Irish expressions, euphemisms. I have a bad habit when I talk about them in this sort of context of using the word fairies, but you're really not supposed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That generally euphemisms are preferred. The idea is that they can pass invisibly at any time. They can be around you at any time and you won't be aware of them. And there are certain terms that they find offensive, that they don't want to hear humans using. Fairies is one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so to sort of avoid annoying them, you use euphemisms. And there's a lot of euphemisms out there. There's a lot of them in English. There's a lot of them in Irish. There's some in Welsh. And I know there's, in Cornish and Manx, pretty much any of the Celtic language speaking cultures
Mm-hmm.
that believes in these beings is going to prefer to use the euphemisms because it's just thought to be safer. You're not going to offend them with a euphemism. And, the idea is also sort of inherent in that if they hear you using the euphemism, maybe it will remind them that they can potentially be more kindly inclined
Right.
on occasion, which is never a bad thing because, of course, the actual beings, as opposed to the Disney versions,
Mm-hmm.
are or can be, I shouldn't say are, but can be potentially dangerous, and you really don't want to upset them or annoy them. So euphemisms are the way to go.
Okay.
And that's an old practice that's been traced back least in writing. I think it's 500 years
Mhm.
at least. So um, that's the safer way to go.
Awesome. And one of the things I've seen in some of my research is the same thing exists within the Islamic world. I'm talking about the jinn. Yeah, it's very similar. Um, and it's again, it's the same thing. It's like it's the good people, and it's interesting some of the terms there, like the nobility, um, the others, and all that kind of stuff. Now, one of the things you said there towards the end there about they can be dangerous beings, and obviously you immediately juxtapose that with the Disney image.
Yeah.
Because I get that kind of all the time from people that are like, what are you going on about, banging on about fairies for? Like, it's not what you think. um,
Right.
the dangerous element to them. I mean, jinn are notoriously, people are afraid of them. It's still a very living thing.
Mhm.
But with fairies, from my experience growing up in the west of Ireland, it was certainly a kind of a generational thing.
Mhm.
It was like kind of older people were much more aware of the presence of them in their lives. So, with that context of people not really understanding why these beings are dangerous, could you talk to that?
That's such a wide topic. There's so much to get into there. Yeah, and I agree with you about the generational thing. I first sort of got clued in to the other crowd by my grandfather. He was from Cork
Okay.
originally,
Yeah.
and he definitely had that older perspective on them, that you were respectful and
Hmm.
you didn't want them angry with you.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that does sort of color my viewpoint and affect how I approach them. But um, it's definitely a very widespread view.
Oh, I think I just lost you. It's Paul. Yes, you're back.
There we go.
Okay.
This is, every single time I do an interview about this subject, there's always some
Yeah.
some randomness.
Well, the question
Um,
I ask you, why are the fairies dangerous? And your connection drops. Yeah, straight away.
there we go
Okay.
again. Now I lost you.
I can hear you.
Okay, there
Yeah.
we go. I lost you then. I feel like I did not put out enough butter before I did this morning. Um,
Brilliant.
I,
Okay.
I always make a little offering now before I do these interviews, and still we get
That's a good
the
tip, actually. I
shenanigans.
might start doing that as well.
Yeah, it never fails.
Yeah.
If I'm doing any sort of video or Zoom and it's not this subject,
Hmm.
it's smooth and it's fine.
Yeah.
But if it's this particular subject, there's always some sort of shenanigans afoot.
Brilliant.
There's no escape. But yes, getting back to them being dangerous. um, if you look at the older beliefs, or even the beliefs as they still are in some places, it was always thought that the good folk can be helpful or beneficial if they choose to, but they can also be dangerous, and the dangers can be extreme. It's not just sort of this modern perception that some people can have, that they can be a little mischievous or perhaps a little annoying.
Hmm.
They can cause blindness, they can cause madness, they can cause a lot of different various illnesses. They can kill you. Just,
Hmm.
doesn't get much more extreme than that.
Yep.
Um, or, kill your livestock,
Hmm.
or, ruin your luck, anything along those lines. And so this is why the respect for them and the need to be using the euphemisms,
Hmm.
and reminding them that they can also potentially be more beneficial to
Hmm.
humanity. And there's so many stories in folklore and anecdotal accounts of people who annoyed them, and sort of the negative consequences of that. Um, And a lot of times when you annoy them, there's no fixing it.
Yeah.
You can't just apologize always and move
Mm.
forward. The consequences of that are going to be permanent. So
Mhm.
something people need to consider.
Yeah. Absolutely. And can those things be generational as well? Like, can fairies have a problem with a family that goes on multi generations, or how do
Um,
they?
I would think so. I can't think of any examples that I'm aware of in folklore, which doesn't mean there aren't any.
Mhm.
Obviously, I am not aware of 100% of the folklore that's out there.
Right.
But we certainly have accounts of different types of otherworldly beings that have a clear vested interest in family lines.
Hmm.
The whole concept of the Manashi banshees
Hmm.
in English,
Yeah.
the idea of a fairy woman who's attached to a particular family.
Yeah.
Some of those go back 1,000 years. The
Right.
idea that this fairy woman attached to this particular family,
Mm.
one particular person for a reason, but then continues to follow that family line.
Yeah.
And in that case, in the case of the banshee, to appear to warn of an
Mm.
oncoming death.
Mm.
But the fact that they're willing to do that, we have evidence of that. I would certainly say if you manage to offend them badly enough
Mm.
or upset them enough, that it would
Mm.
be possible
Yeah.
uh, to see that negative consequence in that same way
Okay.
carrying on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, I mean, certainly from my exploration in this subject matter, I kind of ended up learning a lot about my own family and my kind of direct experiences that both my parents have had,
Mhm.
um, in seeing what they assume were these beings.
Mhm.
But certainly my father um, told me last October when I was kind of discussing this topic, who was kind of came with me to for one of my trips to India, where I was shooting all, particularly the stuff about Jinn in Delhi. Wouldn't have anything to do with it. Was very much just like you're and I quote, "You're nuts." I was like, well, yeah, it's kind of the part of the job.
Yeah.
But went off and I shot the stuff, and then tells me 3 years later that yeah, he heard the banshee when he was a kid. When his grandmother
Wow.
died. Who was surname was Mac,
Mhm.
and from the north, and yeah, he said it was the most just he's in his early 70s now, and he said it's still thinking about it, it's frightening. He
Yeah.
said it was such a terrifying noise, like so yeah, he said he heard it twice for in the one period. He said it was just yeah, absolutely gut wrenchingly terrifying. Uh,
Yeah. Oh, I believe it.
yeah, yeah, but
That's
stuff just starts coming out of the woodwork like that. Yeah, um,
yeah. Um, and I think a lot of people, I think a lot more people than we realize have experiences or have
mm,
had these experiences. They're just not willing to talk about them.
yeah,
You know.
yeah, and that was actually one of my points I wanted to ask you about. I know from your bio and your work online that you've do a lot of historical research,
Mhm.
including translating medieval Irish. And as an Irish person with terrible Irish, I'm doubly impressed by that. Modern Irish was tricky enough for me, not getting into medieval stuff, so very impressed.
Everyone needs a
Um,
hobby.
I'm still on Duolingo.
Yep.
I must learn my heritage. But what was I going to say is, like, do you come across accounts of modern fairy experiences? Do people reach out to you with, I've just had a really bizarre experience and I don't really know how to frame it. Can you help me? That kind of thing happen to you?
I do, yeah. Yeah. I mostly privately,
Yeah.
because again, I think people it's actually sort of a funny juxtaposition because there are certainly things that people are very willing to talk about publicly, but they're usually the sort of and I don't mean shallow here so much in a negative way, but the sort of shallow, brief, more positive
Mm-hmm.
experiences, like they were out in a field and they thought they saw some lights
Mm-hmm.
and they had a very pleasant feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Those sorts of things people are more willing to talk about
Yeah.
publicly. But I do get people contacting me privately, and I have over the course of
Mm-hmm.
several years of
Mm-hmm.
anecdotal accounts, usually when they've had something very negative happen, or they're struggling with sort of an ongoing negative situation, and they just don't know what to do about it.
Yeah.
um, because it's not like we are currently in a world where it's easy to find
Mm-hmm.
people who can advise you on what to do if you think you've really
Mm-hmm.
angered the good neighbors,
Yeah.
and they're seriously messing with you,
Mm-hmm.
um, or they're driving you crazy. I've seen that twice now with people who had an experience that started out sort of positive,
Mm-hmm.
connecting to an otherworldly being, and then it sort of turned and became something very negative, and then they didn't know how to get out of it
Mm-hmm.
effectively. Um,
And was that from, say, is that something they instigated? I mean, I see kind of a lot of books online about talking about fairy magic or kind of engaging with fairies. And I mean, I know that it's a big thing in the Islamic world. People kind of engaging with jinn to gain knowledge, all that kind of stuff, or to enslave jinn on their behalf.
you
Um,
know,
as sorcery.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but does the same exist for the fairy world?
It does. There's like three different layers to this. So it's going to be a little bit of a complicated topic to get into, but um, to answer the very first part of that question, most of the people who end up contacting me, it was almost like an accidental beginning with
Right.
them. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you might say, or they have just moved and they've moved into some place that has fairy issues. To give you one example, this is from probably 10 years ago. A woman had moved into a new home that had been empty for several years and was starting to renovate and was starting to put up a lot of wrought iron all
Mm-hmm.
around, and was standing at the top of a 6 foot tall earth embankment
Mm-hmm.
and was shoved off of it
Right.
and broke her arm.
Ooh.
Yeah, and was concerned and just wasn't sure what to do. And clearly the main issue was that she was coming in and putting in a lot of iron.
Yeah.
Um, they do not like the iron.
No, they don't.
So no. But she wasn't seeking them out or trying to connect to them.
Mm-hmm.
She just happened to move into a space that they were also in,
Mm-hmm.
sort of being ignorant of all of that, and
Mm-hmm.
then that's what happened.
Polluting it
um,
effectively. From, yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But in a wider sense, there's basically these three approaches we see in a modern context, magically. There are people now, this has been the last couple of years, it's sort of gained popularity, who are getting more into the sorcery, the ceremonial magic
Mm-hmm.
aspect with fairies. And that tradition runs back, at least 300 years. There's grimoires from the 17th century, 18th century that talk about fairies and how to invoke them and bind them and, get them to do specific things.
Mm-hmm.
And I have seen a revival in that. And that seems very similar to what you were talking about with the jinn sorcery,
Mm-hmm.
sort of calling them up in order to control them.
Mm-hmm.
I won't express my opinion on the wisdom of that, but
Mm-hmm.
that is definitely a thing that some people are doing. And that's, based on the historical
Mm-hmm.
practices. There's definitely also sort of a swath of people who base their understanding of fairies on the more Victorian New Age,
Mm-hmm.
Disney-esque idea, which really recharacterizes who and what those beings are. Um, and I could talk at length about how that all happened and progressed and became what it is, but it really casts them more in the light of nature spirits and elementals
Mm-hmm.
and guides for humans. So a lot of the books that you see out there that's the tone and the approach they're taking. That these are not necessarily beings who have any inherent power or innate ability to really do a lot, but that they're worth connecting to because they'll help your plants grow better, or they'll make your life feel happier and maybe give you some good advice about how to be a better human being. And again, I won't express my opinion about that either.
Hmm.
That is definitely a big thing that's out
Hmm.
there. The third view, which is more of my own personal approach and the way I write about it, is looking at the folklore and the more traditional understanding of fairies. And it's almost like dealing with them magically, in a way, out of self-defense. They're there. If you work magic, if you work certain types of folk magic, um, you are quite possibly going to run across them at various points. And it's better to know how to do that as safely as possible.
Hmm.
Um, the analogy I usually use for that third approach, I'm not the only one who does this, by the
Hmm.
way. Um, but for that third approach is that, if you're going to go hiking in the woods, you want to know what predators you might run into, what dangers there might be,
Hmm.
so that you can hike as safely as possible.
Hmm.
So that's sort of the third approach to fairies. Laura O'Brien teaches some classes about fairies out of the Irish Pagan School, and that's sort of her approach as well.
Hmm.
That you may run across them, and if you do, this is how you do it in the safest possible manner.
Right.
And there are certain advantages, and there always have been, to intentionally seeking them out. There's just risk that
Yeah.
comes with that.
Okay.
So
Um, I mean, that seems very sensible to me, to be honest. It's kind of, have an idea what you're dealing with. I mean, the romanticized version of fairies, it, it seems to be a Western thing. I don't know what it is. I think when we went through the process of, um, of disenchantment, where we kind
mhm,
of went through the kind of process of going, right, the world is essentially, it's a very complex clock, and we
yeah.
are very complex biological clocks. That desacralization, that the enchantment of the world, then reduced things like fairies and things like Jinn to, being your kind of Aladdin genie versus your Tinkerbell, and
Mhm,
we've got these kind of caricatures that have essentially defanged these
yes.
creatures, these beings that people in the kind of the local cultures were absolutely terrified of and deeply, deeply cautious of. And it's interesting that it's happened to both these things, but that kind of that you've got that Disney view of Jinn, genie, and then
Mhm.
the Disney view of fairies. Um, but what I wanted to kind of ask you about as well, in terms of kind of dealing with fairies, or particularly in the case you were mentioning about the lady who had unfortunately been putting wrought iron around her home. Well, it wasn't her home either, a home she was sharing, unknown to her. Uh, like, in terms of actually dealing with that issue, you've got, I guess, magicians and exorcists who deal with different types of spirits. But I know in Ireland there was the whole thing of fairy doctors,
Mhm.
who came and dealt with, if your animals were struck, or as you kind of mentioned earlier, if people had afflictions from encounters with the fairies, to help them kind of undo that, or try and fix as much as they could. Does that still exist? Is that a thing that still happens?
I mean, I'm sure that it still does. How difficult it would be to find the people that do that
Mhm.
is more of the issue, I think.
Okay.
Because the knowledge of it is getting more and more obscure. It used to be fairly common knowledge.
Mm.
Uh, just the general precautions, the general things that we now sort of consider less well known, used to be common knowledge. That carry a little iron in your pocket,
Mm.
turn your coat inside out. Um, if the Gyashi, the fairy wind is going by, pick up a bit of dirt off the road and throw it.
Okay.
If you think the fairies have taken someone, that would be something more that a fairy doctor might address. But there were still certain basic things that people knew to look for or to do. And that knowledge has become less common. So certainly the really technical, if you
Hmm.
will,
Hmm.
esoteric knowledge that the fairy doctors had has become much more rare.
Hmm.
I'm sure it is still out there.
Hmm.
You still, the fairies are still out there, and people do still have these issues.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
you're still going to have the experts, if you will.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so when we look at kind of the array of experiences, and I certainly looking through folklore, there's a multitude of different types of fairy. Your brownies, your leprechauns, your banshees, all that kind of stuff.
Kelpie, puka.
Yeah, the whole plethora of different beings.
Yep.
So, in terms of like the terminology, so Jinn is certainly from a catch-all term, and it seems like fairy would be as well.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
What are the kind of more interesting, obscure fairies that you've come across in your research?
Oh, there's so many. I think the really intriguing thing about the good folk is that there it is really this broad generalized category, and a lot of the beliefs are very regional and very specific to certain areas. um, so like the puka, which I was just talking about the other day with some people, is one that you don't see as much anymore. People aren't as familiar with it, although it used to be um, one of the more well-known, I think. um, I mean, there are certainly still people who are familiar with it, but it's really fascinating. And it's, of course, it's puka in Ireland. I
Hmm.
should clarify. It's known by different names in other places, but um, just the fact that it's so widespread. In England it would have been puck. In Welsh it's buka. I think I might be mispronouncing that because my Welsh is awful.
Yeah, I mean it's
Um,
not easy.
not. I do try though.
Fair play.
Yeah. But even if you just look at the puka in Ireland, the way that it would be understood in, say the Southwest,
Mm,
it would have certain specific forms that it might take and certain stories that would be attached to it. But then if you go to the Northwest, it has a very um, different folklore to it. It's the same being, it's the same name.
mm-hmm,
Um, but for example, in the Southwest, if I'm remembering this correctly, like Cork, Kerry, that general area,
mm-hmm,
you would see stories of it, in the form of a goat, or sometimes a sort of older looking man, or a black pony, who would take people for rides and then dump them in a ditch, because that's clearly a very funny joke.
mm,
But if you go more to the north of that northwestern area, Donegal, for example, um, you see it as this sort of formless being, almost like this nightmarish. If you try to look at it, you can't clearly see it,
mm-hmm,
kind of thing. Um, I was just talking the other day to someone who's in Dublin, and he was the one who was telling me about this. It's the same being. It has the same general reputation, the same sort of general stories attached to it, but how it's perceived and how it's described can vary quite a lot. And I find that really, really fascinating.
mm-hmm,
The same thing if we look at, say, the Lananshi, which is gaining a little more popularity because of urban fantasy and paranormal romance, I think. But, I'm not sure that's the most accurate depiction to look at. But the Lananshi, if you look at it in the Irish, besides the ones that are just literally fairies that take human lovers, Lananshi means fairy lover.
Mm.
Um, it sort of in more recent, like the last couple centuries, had become known as this fairy being that would take a human lover and inspire them, but also sort of drain their life force.
Right.
So that they would sort of have these short but brilliant artistic lives. They have that same sort of being in the Isle of Man. The name is very similar, Lananshi, spelled differently because it's Manx, but in that version, in the Manx version of the Lananshi, it's actually vampiric.
Right.
It would actually sort of, if you were, and the Manx one is always female, if you were a gentleman who was wandering out alone at night, happened to go to where this particular fairy lived, she might appear and seduce you and start, literally drinking your blood. And within the space of a few months, of course, you would no longer be among the human living, as it were. So just that sort of regional variation is super fascinating.
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up, the regional variation thing, because this is something that is being just stirring around in my head for a while with the Jinn and the good people. I'm going to start calling the good people now. You've got me into it.
Good habit.
Yeah, exactly. So the similarities are almost remarkable, and you've just struck on another few as well. And certainly the whole thing of like Jinn lovers with humans is a very strong motif in the Islamic world.
Really, that's interesting.
A really strong motif, to the point where there's quite there's a quite strong gender variation in that if a woman has a human woman has as a male Jinn lover, she can conceive and carry a child, and particularly in Morocco, there's a story about black-eyed children that are seen as kind of they're half human, half Jinn, and of the other way around, it ends up with a spiritual child, a spirit child rather. But it's exactly the same thing, and the motifs are there, but it's a common modern thing as well. There's lots of accounts of people having intimate relationships with spirit beings, and it's one of these things you read them like in kind of some sensational papers here, and people are like, "Oh, I'm in love with a ghost." I'm like, "That's not a ghost. That's a Jinn. Yeah, that's not a ghost. You're having a relationship with, and you're being drained as well." But again, the same thing though. You mentioned about that kind of artistic or creative flourish. Jinn are associated with inspiring people for poetry. It's the same thing. They have an encounter with a Jinn, and then all of a sudden they kind of develop this poetry capability. It's remarkable that the
crossover is really fascinating. I did not realize that they had so many. I knew there were some, but I didn't realize there were so many.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a little title made by like a local publisher in County Mayo. It's only kind of a pamphlet, and it's an elderly person who'd accumulated all these folkloric practices and stories and taboos and what have you. And I was flicking through that, and I came across the Gihashi and the Fairy Wind, and I was reading through that, and I was like, "You got to be kidding me." And I saw the Jinn are literally born of the wind. So they're the heat of the Sinim wind, the desert wind, is the smokeless fire that the Jinn are created of, and they're known to kind of travel in the wind. So it's
just almost like the Sluishi.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the same thing. The aversion to iron, same thing. It's yeah. So when I was picking up those, and it's like there's just another. I had no idea that there was the fairy lover thing as well. I mean, and the inspiration thing. That's remarkable.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and it definitely does still happen. I had talked to someone a few years ago who, if I remember correctly, it was their cousin, had this would have happened in I want to say the 90s, had disappeared for like a week.
Right.
And when they showed back up, they didn't realize a week had gone by. They thought it had only been a couple days.
Mm.
And they were pregnant shortly afterwards, they
Wow.
realized. And they had related a story basically about encountering this otherworldly gentleman, if you will, and spending a few days with him. And from, would not at any point say anything else except that that was the father of their child. And a lot of people in the family, from what the person I was talking to had said, believed it,
Yeah.
that they had been taken by the good folk for, a period of time, and that this child was the result of that, and that was not that long ago, comparatively.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really interesting. The changeling thing as well, when we talk about the kind of the taking of children and replacing them with elderly good folk.
Something. Yeah.
That's an interesting motif as well. There's a big taboo around children as well, and the vulnerability of children to like a set period of time from Jinn interaction. There's a lot of taboos around the evil eye as well. Like, you don't want everybody seeing your newborn child because of the evil eye and that kind of thing. But there's a particular association with Lilin demons, which basically are under kind of Lilith, the character associated with Adam.
Adam's first wife.
Adam's first wife, yes. And the mythos around it is essentially, because it didn't work out with her and Adam, that she was robbed, from her perception or from her perspective, was robbed of her birthright, which was to be the mother of the human race, and therefore she takes revenge on all new mothers and on all newborn children. So there's a lot of taboos associated with her, and he's kind of assumed Jinn status as a result of that. But they use other charms, mentioning other Jinn to actually repel her, along with archangels. But they refer to Pazuzu, it's a wind demon, famous from The Exorcist.
Yep.
As a birth talisman to push Lilith and little demons away. But there's a huge amount of that for child taboos as well, isn't it? In the good people world. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. When they go back for such a long way, and to be clear, with the changelings and the Western European view, it's most commonly discussed, I think, today relating to children, but it could also apply to young adults.
Right.
And new mothers and brides were a common one.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of any time a human being was in this sort of liminal state between things.
Yeah.
So clearly a newborn is liminal because they were just came into this world. New mothers are liminal because they're in that state between childbirth and sort of that acceptance back into the community.
Yeah.
That kind of place. Brides in that state between leaving their old family and forming a new one, and so on. But there definitely are a huge number of things that were related to specifically babies and younger children. Although we see changeling stories up through, children like aged 8 and 9. And I could get totally sidetracked just relating changeling stories. But, the similar idea of the you don't want to speak too well of a child or a baby, which is borderline with the evil eye sort of thing. Because with the evil eye, it's because of the jealousy and envy, but with the other crowd, it's because, again, they could be passing at any time unseen, and if they hear you praising this infant or child too highly, they might decide they want to take it. Also, the idea that you should always, this being particularly Western European, you should always say God bless or in the name of God
Mm.
anytime you are saying something positive. And again, this is such that crossover between the evil eye and the changeling
Mm.
material, because if you don't, then the good folk could take the child.
Mm.
But if you don't, that could also be a sign that you're putting the evil eye on the child.
Mm.
Like if a neighbor came by and your child's out and they happen to say, "Oh, what a fine boy you have," and they didn't say God bless him or in the name of God, that could be the neighbor putting the evil eye on the child.
Right.
Or it could open up for the good neighbors to come in and take them. So there's a huge amount of similarity there, which is
Mm.
really fascinating. I'd never thought about that
Mm.
before until you mentioned it. So we see a lot of things like iron being
Mm.
sort of the superlative protection against them, iron over cribs,
Mm.
iron under mattresses of cribs, bread in Western European folklore. It's an interesting thing because it's also used as an offering, but bread is seen as protective. Uh,
Okay.
and there's a couple different references to this, carrying bread in your pocket to protect you against the good folk, but also new mothers and infants having bread
Mm.
near them. Um, it's never explicitly explained why. I think because when we see references to it, like Reverend Kirk in his Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies mentions this one. I think it was just assumed that people reading it would already know.
Right.
Like, why would you have bread? Well, everyone knows that. Um, but I think the general idea seems to be that they would take the bread and not the child.
Right. Okay.
So you'd sort of like a substitute,
Mm.
if you will. And then, of course, holy symbols, holy books
Mm.
being out were supposed to deter them. And there's a long practice, particularly in the Aran Islands and the Galway area,
Mm.
although it was more widespread than that, but it's particularly known in those areas, of dressing boys until they were 5 or 6 in dresses
Yeah.
as girls, because the thought was that the good folk were more likely to take boys.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And there's some really interesting pictures of that
Mm.
that you can find, historic pictures. Although I have heard very rational people point out that it's just much easier to dress.
There's probably a lot to that as well, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
what was I going to say is the interesting about the bread and milk is there's a site I photographed in Delhi called Feroz Shah Kulta, and this is it's Delhi's made up of all these kind of old cities that have kind of fallen and risen again. But Feroz Shah Kulta is one of those cities, or Ferozabad was one of those cities, and Feroz Shah Kulta is the ruins of it, and it's associated with Jinn. It's basically kind of seen as the most haunted place in Delhi. It's supposed to be home to 10,000 Jinn, and
Interesting.
yeah, it's an interesting place. So I went there to photograph it, and all over the place there's these little grottos where people kind of they do it kind of almost like Stations of the Cross. They would kind of depending on what they're doing, they're petitioning the Jinn to intercede on their behalf. There's lots of letters there left to the Jinn to ask for things. But one of the things that's really common were offerings of bread and milk, just
Fascinating.
plates with bread and milk. Yeah, I'll send you some photographs of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And again, like in clootie trees back in Ireland, with the rags tied to the
Yeah, yeah.
branches, very similar things to that. Tie threads to particularly kind of red threads to the railings of around the site and locks as well. It's kind of
Wow.
symbolizing the whatever the exchange was, whatever that kind of you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Symbolizing that relationship, that bond. Um, and yeah, it was kind of every Thursday. That place is absolutely crammed with people. Going
Wow.
around. And I met a family who were doing that, and I spoke to the father, and and he was saying, yeah, no, it's we're so we're like 8 days in on a 2 week working.
Yeah.
Um, and like I went back every day, went to every single shrine in there, and left sweets and a lantern for them, and said stuff happened. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
He said it's already working. That's where
Yeah.
his words, you know. Um, but
I definitely believe it works.
yeah, I think so. You know, it was re- really interesting to see. You know,
Yeah.
and again, very much a living belief. But you know, kind of you know yourself with holy wells and all that kind of stuff back in Ireland. You know, there's always some saint that's been kind of you know projected in front of it.
Put
And,
put on it. Yep.
yeah, exactly. And but you know the practice and what happens there has got nothing to do with the saint. You know, it's usually predates it by millennia, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And but yeah, Clutie trees, exactly the same thing, same practices.
Wow.
But tying
Yeah,
it,
the similarity in the practices is, it definitely goes a lot deeper than I realized. Because,
yeah,
and of course you know, in Ireland, the offering dairy,
yeah,
milk and butter,
mm,
offering bread, or cakes, you know,
mm,
that's such a I don't know that as many people do it now as
yeah,
used to. I don't know that as many people would admit that they do it now
yeah.
as used to.
Well, I didn't know about the
It,
bread thing. I didn't know from the fairy side, from the good people side. Correct myself.
yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know about that. That people would give gifts in that way. It's again, like it just gets deeper and deeper. But the bit for me, the big question for me is this: is that have we got two cultures describing the same thing?
Hmm.
Um, but it's got a culturally specific language. So whatever this thing is that we're engaging with, that we're kind of have these touch points to, does it have the ability to kind of pick up on cultural cues, and then kind of reflect them back to us?
Hmm.
Like, so we understand that we have a language that we can kind of interpret. Um, whereas, you know, if somebody had an experience with one of these beings that is not from an Irish culture or a Celtic culture or not from an Islamic culture, what would they see? You know, what would they? You know, I guess in the Norse world, you have the idea of elves and trolls and what have you, and very similar. You know, treat
Yep. Alfar and Huldafolk.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, is there an American equivalent?
There are. I mean, I don't know that there's any, because you know, the thing that we run into in the Americas is, again, everything is so regionally specific,
Right.
and you have different Native American tribal groups
Mm,
in different areas with different beliefs
mm,
and different systems. And I certainly cannot speak to all of them.
mm,
Um, the ones that I am familiar with, however, uh, do have beings that, you know, seem to at least generally fit the wider criteria. Um, you know, where I happen to live now, the one of the local tribes has these beings that are called Makiawisug, and they are about 2 or 3 feet tall. They look human. They're just human, you know, but in a smaller scale,
mm,
if you will. Um, you were never supposed to look directly at them if you happen to see them, or you know, if they're around you, because looking directly at them offends them,
mm,
which is something that we do see in Western European fairy lore. The idea that fairies can get very upset if you are seeing them when they don't want to be seen. Um, that the Makiwisa can be helpful, but they can also, you know, be dangerous if they're offended or insulted. Um, so, you know, there's certainly those levels of crossover. The Cherokee have the Yunwitsundi and the Nunahai, which are also sort of similar um, types of beings. There was an idea, if you went into the forest and had any sort of encounters that might be the Yonuitsundi, you didn't want to offend them because they could either help you or hinder you. So you had to be very respectful. And they're spirits that are in nature, but they're not embodiments of nature, and clearly very anthropomorphized. But
Mm.
you would leave them certain offerings of things that they liked. Dairy was not a thing in the Americas before colonization, but other things that they might like, you would leave them. So it's definitely really interesting. I do have a friend who is, well, actually, I have a couple friends who are very into Tibetan Buddhism, but one particular friend who's very into Tibetan Buddhism has talked a lot about the spirits that they have in that belief system. And they also have these striking similarities to the Western European fairies.
Wow.
You would offer them milk. Is a big thing. Everyone likes milk, apparently. If you're a culture that has milk, then that's
Yeah,
what
yeah, yeah.
spirits want. And they have, in some cases, some of them a similar aversion to iron. They can be helpful, but they can also be very dangerous if they're offended. Trying to think of some of the other things that she's said to me, because we've had a lot of conversations over the years about this. But it's very striking to me, sort of wherever you go around the globe, it seems like you have these otherworldly beings. The Western European term in English is fairy. Every culture has their own name for them. So it seems to be more than just something that one particular
Yeah,
culture invented.
yeah. That's my thoughts on it too. Is that we're in a relationship with something that's cross cultural completely, but definitely is able to pick up on the local symbolic languages that we have and reflect and engage them with us.
It's kind of an intriguing question whether it's mimicry, like they're just imitating the local humans to kind of connect and communicate, or whether they're purely doing it so that we can understand them in some sense. Because humans are just so darn anthropocentric.
Yeah.
It's really hard for humans to get out of the mindset that humanity is sort of the center of everything.
Yes. Yeah. Very true. Very true. One interesting angle I found with this is the idea of the authority or spiritual superiority of Christianity in Western Europe and then Islam in the Islamic world, naturally. But that, like, with the idea is within the Quran, actual Muhammad has a direct kind of conversation with the jinn. He lectures them, if I remember correctly. And that there's the idea that there is jinn who convert to Islam, and that there's jinn who are kind of all different Abrahamic faiths, or have no belief whatsoever. And I know within the kind of the origin mythos around jinn, there's the idea of that they are one of three beings that Allah created. So it's light. Angels were fashioned out of light, jinn were fashioned out of smokeless fire, and human beings were fashioned out of sounding clay. And but human beings were given free will. The jinn also have free will, the angels do not. But when Allah created Adam, he ordered all these beings to bow down to him. And Iblis, who was with the angels, but not an angel. He was a jinn of such repute that he was somehow elevated amongst the angelic host. But he basically rebelled. So that's where the rebel myth comes from, and then the tension between kind of jinn and human beings comes from that jealousy.
Interesting.
So it's the fall. That's the whole thing. So it ties back to the fairy myth of fallen angels. Yeah, same thing. But where the authority of Abrahamic religion over fairies' powers. Where when where do you think that comes from? Is that our projection, or does it work? You know.
Um, I think it only partially works.
Mm,
We see the same thing with the Western European fairies. I should say specifically with the Celtic language speaking
mm,
cultural fairies that you were just talking about with the Jinn.
mm.
So we see some that are explicitly Christian,
Oh wow! I
and
didn't know
there's there's quite a few different accounts of fairies who would go to like the local parish priest and ask him if they were going to be saved, if there would be a on
that.
the day of judgment, if there was a possibility of salvation
Mm,
for themselves. And usually the way the story goes is that the priest says no,
mm,
because they're not of the seed of Adam, as
mm,
it were.
mm,
And the fairies either despair at hearing that answer or get very angry.
mm,
But we have several accounts across like England and Scotland of fairies who make reference to being Christians, or make reference to being averse to Christian symbols because they feel like they've been cast out
right.
or pushed out of it in some way.
Yeah.
But then we have others who very explicitly are pagan in whatever sense you want to take that in, that are non-Christian,
Hmm.
and really don't seem particularly affected by Christian prayer or Christian authority,
Mm,
although they might find it offensive in
right.
some way. So there's stories of like church bells driving out fairies because they just can't bear the sound
Hmm.
of the church bell. Church bells were also often iron bells,
Mm.
though, so
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
it's
Wait, what is the iron thing? What is it?
the eternal question.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, people ask me that all the time, but again, like the bread, it's something that constantly gets
Mm,
referenced, but no one ever explains
mm,
why. There is a reference, it's about 2,000 years old in Pliny the Elder, writing obviously in Rome, but he was talking about the Gauls, and that they had a belief when they were gathering herbs, medicinal herbs or herbs for spiritual use, that you could never cut the plant with an iron knife because the iron would drive out the spirit of the plant.
right.
So we can at least say that the idea of
Mm,
iron
mm,
driving out certain types of spirits goes back a really, really long way.
wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible. In one of the sites that I photographed in Delhi, they had an iron chain hanging outside this saint's shrine.
Mhm.
Um, and it was like a tiny little shrine in Delhi's Ridge Forest. But yeah, basically, there was two kind of barriers to, or not barriers, but rather kind of two methods they used to detect the presence of jinn or evil spirit. Two separate things in people who were brought to the shrine. First one was this iron chain that hung above the threshold. The idea was used to hold the iron chain and then say a dua, which is like a prayer.
Prayer. Hmm.
And if you couldn't do both, that was an indication. And the second one was passing the threshold into the sacred space. That was again an indication of an issue. But that iron was like, it was polished, like
Yeah.
from human touch. It is well used. But yeah, it was exactly the same thing. And in the sacred spaces around there, it was like there would have been like iron chains wrapped around trees, again with a padlock,
Hmm.
and again signifying that kind of this is a sacred space. But yeah, it was remarkable. Actually, one of the cool things there is they had these things called maklas, and they were like just kind of a pottery vessel.
Yeah.
They were kind of peppered around the forest floor, and so I was asking kind of what exactly were these, told not to go near them, and what they were traps, prisons for jinn. So,
Ah,
so it's where the kind of the genie in the bottle thing comes from. That's basically what it's from. Things are being
oh, that's
extracted and commanded into these vessels.
that's fascinating. I did
Yeah,
not know that.
yeah, yeah. It was kind of like a spiritual landmines kind of peppered around the forest floor. But yeah,
It's a
there
little
was
terrifying.
yeah, totally. It was yeah, quite quite full on. Kind of been there in that regard. I had one other question as well.
Sure.
Is there do is there kind of a thing around dreams? Do fairies get into people's dreams at all?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, do Jin do that? Because now I'm
Yeah,
really curious.
yeah,
Oh,
they're
see,
famous for it. Yeah,
I'm, I'm I'm really sold now on the
yeah,
idea that Jin and fairies are either extremely similar
yeah,
or possibly the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very old um, concept, and again, like you can find this in writing evidence of
Mhm.
this, 500-600 years back at least,
Yeah.
that fairies would come to people while they were sleeping in dreams. And again, sometimes for malicious reasons,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes for more positive reasons,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes just to tell you not to build your barn where you were trying to build it. There's actually one more recent account, I want to say it was like 100, 150 years ago, of that,
Mm-hmm.
where a farmer was getting ready to build a new barn, and he went to sleep and he had a dream of this man of the fairies coming to him and basically trying to explain that there was a fairy path
Mm-hmm.
um, through part of where he was trying to build the barn, and that he needed to move it. And of course, he didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And he built it anyway. And then, his cows died, and then his son died, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, terrible consequences. But
Yeah.
yeah, we definitely see accounts of them
Mm.
communicating in dreams, and also of people traveling to the world of fairy sometimes in dreams.
Right.
So uh,
It's remarkable the level of crossover.
it
Uh,
really is.
yeah, there's a lot there. Um, I'll send you a list of some of the stuff that I've been using as research material, and have a look. But yeah, I found one a couple of weeks back, which was my parents had kindly sent me over an article about the fairies from the Western people, the county newspaper in back in Mayo, and there was that the cutting I sent you, that
Yeah,
the boo around casting out Ishka Salak like dirty water for your non-Irish speaking
yeah. Yep.
listeners, and exactly the same thing around bathrooms in particular within but it was Egypt.
Yeah.
Particular reference was same thing. It's like, do you watch where you're throwing stuff out? Do you give Jinn warning if you're throwing out bath water? Um, yeah, I mean, just like for like, it's remarkable. Um, so I mean, the dream stuff, the bread stuff, I've learned loads. Really appreciate you coming on the show. You've opened my eyes to, I think, a lot more of the commonalities here.
Yeah, no, this is
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah,
I enjoyed your interview with Lonnie because you had mentioned about gin and possession,
yeah.
and that's something we see with fairies too.
Oh,
That
come on.
they'll,
Right. We're not stopping
yeah.
this. Keep going. This is fantastic. Brilliant.
Because I was thinking
Yeah.
that when I was listening to your
Yeah.
interview when you were talking about it, because I didn't realize that that was a thing that jinn were
Mm,
known to do. But yeah, there's been accounts of fairies possessing people, and
amazing.
that's yeah, it's the crossover is just really fascinating. That was one of the things that the fairy doctors would have to know how to deal with.
Right.
And then we also see that like in Anglo-Saxon England, which is going back, 1,000 and more years, different cures in the leech books for people who are possessed by alpha, which is elves, basically
Yeah.
fairies. And how to tell when a person's possessed by an elf specifically and not a demon or a
Mm,
different kind of spirit,
mm,
and then how to drive them out. Mugwort, by the way, is the answer. Burn
okay.
mugwort. Yeah, mugwort
Okay.
fumes
Right.
will break fairy enchantments and drive them out,
Right.
according to the leech books.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
Right.
really interesting.
Yeah. This is Lonnie was right. Nice one, Lonnie. That's incredible. I had no idea that was a thing.
Oh
Fairy
yeah,
possession.
yeah. There's actually a word for it in Anglo-Saxon. Ilfige is what it's called. It specifically means possession by fairies.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's really, really remarkable. We'll have to do this again, I think. There's lots more to unpack here.
I'd love to.
You
I
know,
didn't
and
even get into personal experiences.
I've got time if you have. So let's
I'll
go
start.
for it. Yeah, personal experiences. Like we both have a few, I think.
Yeah.
You go first.
Oh, I've got a couple. Well, I've got more than a couple that I can share publicly. I've got a couple. Let me think. Well, I'll share a negative one and a positive one. So, a negative one, I was talking at the beginning when we were talking about euphemisms and consequences about the whole blindness thing. I actually went temporarily blind for 3 days.
Wow.
Which I do not recommend.
Yeah, I can imagine.
To anyone, because I did something that I shouldn't have done, basically. Crossing boundaries you shouldn't cross. Offended them, we'll just say. And yeah, so I spent 3 days. I did go to the emergency room because no matter what spiritual beliefs you have, modern medicine is still a good thing. And baffled all the doctors. They could not explain what was going on. I had an eye infection, but they had no idea what was causing it, what kind of eye infection it was. I just ended up with like a filmy coating over my eyes, so I couldn't see. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where doctors are looking at you and have, no explanation for what's going on and are very confused. It's not a fun place.
I can imagine it's very frightening.
It is.
Yeah.
It is, especially when it's eyesight. I mean, I have glasses. My eyesight's not great to begin with, but I do appreciate what eyesight I have. And yeah, so for 3 days it was like that, and then I sort of apologized and made amends for what I had done that upset them. And then I literally woke up one day and it was gone. I was fine. So that was an interesting experience.
Wow.
And that definitely contributes to why I do take it as seriously as I do.
Yeah.
When I warn people there can be negative consequences, and I was lucky. I mean, that could have been permanent.
Sure.
Because they are known to do that. So, positive story. This is one I've never shared before, so this will be brand new, fresh content.
Thank you.
My middle child is 12. I have 3 children, and she has a lot of medical issues. She was born with medical issues. She's a wonderful kid, super smart, wonderful kid. But she's struggled with some medical stuff. And about 1.5 years ago, she was diagnosed with scoliosis, which just on top of everything else,
Sure.
was kind of rough. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with this, I assume you probably haven't. When you have a child who has scoliosis, you have to go have their back checked.
Right.
In her case, because the curve seemed to be growing very quickly, we were going in every 3 months, and it was right on the cusp of her needing a brace, a sleep brace, which we were dreading. She is autistic and she has some sensory issues, and that would not, it would not have gone over well. And I rarely ask the good folk for things because that's generally not a good thing to do. It just opens you up to problems. But this was sort of an exceptional circumstance.
Yeah.
And so sort of in desperation, probably like those people at that shrine you were talking about, I did end up asking for help with it. And I wasn't expecting any particular result, just, help, because they are connected to good health as well as bad. And I made some offerings. And when we went for the next 3 months checkup after that last one, And the curve when we had gone previously had been at just under 20%, which is right where they start. 20% is where you need a brace. So
Okay.
it was just shy of that. When we went 3 months later for the checkup, her back was straight. Like,
Wow.
yeah, completely straight. I'll send you the
Incredible.
pictures.
That's
So
phenomenal.
I have the x-rays, and
Yeah.
I was genuinely shocked.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. Even as someone who believes in this and who
Yeah. Yeah.
incorporates this, into their spirituality, that was shocking.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was
Mhm.
good. It was positive.
Yeah.
But that was why I was saying when you were talking about the family
Mhm.
going to the shrine that I believe
Yeah.
that when you do things like that, there can be results.
Yeah. Well, I do too. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like the whole thing for me. What like shifted my view of the world was really that photographic trip. I mean, I've always been I've always been a curious person, particularly to this. Um, your 14 paranormal stuff has always been kind of an interest of mine. I've always been there. I think
Right.
I think there's a lot of people who are in this territory that, they talk, you can't kind of pinpoint, a thing where it shifted their viewpoint. It's always slightly been there. There might be something that escalated it, but it's always kind of been there to a degree. So
Yeah.
I went off to shoot this story in Delhi about Jinn. And I, I had a quite full on like nightmare before, but about 2 weeks before I was due to go.
Okay.
And it was at a kind of in a kind of a Sufi shrine. I'm there, kind of sitting there in the Sufi shrine, and they have kind of a lot of celebratory music kind of every Thursday night. So it's one of the holy days, plus a holy day in the week where they have a lot of celebratory music. And I was kind of sitting there at one of those events, and then I looked to my left, and a Sufi basically had kind of no face. It was like a skull face
Okay.
with a snake going in one eye and out the other, and just said, "Don't come here." And it was like
That's intense.
it was full on, quite direct. And I've spoken about this a few times in interviews, and it was one of those ones where I was genuinely kind of going, what do I do? I mean, like, this is part of my job, is
Right.
going to photograph sites that, like, I've would pitch these stories to the agencies I worked for, image libraries, and they'd be like, yeah, okay, we're interested. Let us know when you have the stuff, and we'll send it out in the newswires. So I was kind of quite freaked out by it. Then kind of got to a space where I was like, okay, I think it's just nerves, what have you. It's kind of manifesting this dream.
Just a nightmare.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of rationalized it. Did some, I did a little bit of kind of ancestor praying, kind of like try and keep me safe from this. And because I was traveling so much, I had a bit of a thing for Saint Christopher as a protector. I always had a Saint Christopher medal with me.
Okay.
So anyway, my camera broke. So before I was supposed to go, and an absolute catastrophic failure of the camera. One where I brought it
Okay.
to professional cleaners. They're like, we can't clean it. We don't know what it is. We've not sure if it's some of the oil inside the camera, but we can't clean it. So I brought it to the place where basically the camera engineers take their cameras to be cleaned.
Okay.
They had a look at it, and then the clock's ticking for me. I've got like a window of departure getting closer and closer. My camera's completely failed. It's not even a year old. I can't find the guarantee for it, which is the kind of thing that I'm quite pedantic about. So camera failed, can't find the receipt for it. The engineers then came back and said, you have to replace the entire kind of heart of the camera. So it's not even kind of,
Ouch.
it's not even financially viable. It's like £900 job,
Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, well, it's a paperweight now. So
It's not
managed to,
anything you ever want to say about an expensive camera.
no, it was just like, oh. So yeah, once I kind of got over the emotional distress of, an expensive camera not being worth much anymore, managed to acquire a new camera body from a friend. And this is the trip my dad came with me, and before we're leaving in Heathrow, he breaks his tooth in literally sitting in departures. He like holds the jaw, he's broken his tooth.
Oh no.
So we get to Delhi. It's a 16, 20 hours all round trip with connecting flights and what have you. And then our hotel doesn't pick up the phone when I'm calling them. We're getting kind of loads of hassle. I had to change hotel 3 times in 2 days. So we're just getting hassled from scammers and kind of again they kept ringing our hotel, just wouldn't answer, didn't answer the phone. So we had all this lot of like all this hassle, and then like things went. Um, things were challenging at home for my partner at the same time. So it all kind of kicked off. Nothing was catastrophic, but I did definitely get to the point of like, this is a little bit full on now. Like
Yeah.
this is not normal. Shot the work, and then kind of came home. But it was like a quite unpleasant trip. And I'd spent like 6 months in India beforehand. I had nothing like this in terms of hassle. And like I know, and I'd shot places like where people were conducting rituals and drinking whiskey out of skulls and stuff, and I had nothing like this in terms of the hassle. The minute I went kind of photographing the gin, it all kind of
Problems.
problems, and again, like nothing kind of completely like absolutely catastrophic, but just an accumulation of bad luck,
Right.
and an expensive bad luck as well,
Yeah.
but I definitely kind of came back with that feeling of like, yeah, that wasn't normal. There's something to that. But it was weird in the sense that it did kind of, that particular shoot led to some lectures, and ultimately kind of led to YouTube channel and this podcast. That was the subject matter, and that's where I kind of I've had most of my audience is
Yeah.
from people kind of interested in the gym. But like yourself, I get kind of emails with requests for not so much help me with gym problems. They're usually the reverse. They're usually kind of like, how do I get the gin to do something for me? And it's like, have you not listened to my podcast? Listen to what I'm saying. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, like this magic does exist, and this practice does exist. People do these things,
Yep.
but like they generally don't kind of, they cost. There's a
Yeah.
price
Oh,
to pay.
I get that too.
Mm,
The people who are like, how do I
yeah.
see these beings, or how do I connect to them? And it's
Mm,
like, well, read a lot of folklore first, and then
mm,
maybe
yeah. Yeah.
reconsider
Yeah.
actually want to do this. And did I mention that I went blind for a while?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah. Totally. Uh, yeah. I mean, and it's like look at the structure of these tales. It's like any kind of interaction with these beings, um, generally doesn't end well.
yeah.
There was always some punitive element to it.
Well,
Which
and it's
sorry, go ahead.
the Western European folklore, and even the anecdotal accounts, even
Mm,
into the modern ones, no matter what, it changes a person. You
yeah.
know, I'll tell you one other quick story, because I'm sure you don't want to be on Zoom with me all day. But so my husband, he's not a skeptic exactly, but
Mhm.
he's not a believer exactly either. He's sort of in that middle ground.
Yeah.
And he's not generally super sensitive to otherworldly sorts of things.
Hmm.
He had an experience with a ghost when he was an older teenager, like 18, 19. But he's not one of these people who, like, every other week is tripping over
Yeah.
something supernatural. And he is not into the good neighbors at all. That is not his thing. He doesn't know a lot about it, which is fine.
Hmm.
That is okay. So this one particular night, he and I were sitting in our living room, and we both heard the sound of music, like bells.
Hmm.
Um, it it's hard to describe hearing something like that and being
Hmm.
unnerved by it if you've never heard it.
Right.
Because the sound itself was just like music and bells, and it wasn't like scary music, but
Mm.
there's such a feeling of dread that comes with it. Um, I immediately suspected it was probably something like the Sluishi.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen those once before. I have no desire to ever do that again, because that was genuinely terrifying. So I was like to him, "Do you hear that?" He said he did. So I was like, "Well, that's not a good thing." But at the time, he used to smoke, and he was like, "Well, I'm going to go out
Mm-hmm.
and smoke a cigarette." And I'm like, "Well, that might not be the best idea,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, if you want to go out and smoke, go out and smoke." I didn't say anything else. I didn't talk about what I thought the sound was. Um, I just let it go. And like I said, he's not into this stuff. He doesn't know much about it. He's not a huge believer in it. Casual believer, we'll say. So he goes out. 30 seconds later, he comes flying back in the door and closes it and locks it. And I'm like, well, what's going on? We live in the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
To frame this, he went out in our front yard and he started hearing the sound of horses' hooves on the pavement. And he looked straight out into the road and saw red glowing eyes
Ooh.
about 6 feet off the ground. And he came flying back in the house. And he's not a cowardly person. He's fairly brave. And at this point he was in his late 30s or maybe
Mm.
40. He would not go outside at night for a good 6 months after that.
Oh, I'm with him. I would
Yeah.
take me a year.
He,
That's properly terrifying.
yeah.
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 Oh.
And I'm glad I wasn't out there with him.
Mm.
No offense to him, but
No.
I was fine
I
inside.
totally get it. Yeah. No, that's properly frightening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's-
We used to we had a kind of an elderly farmer who lived beside us. So I grew up in Galway.
Mhm.
Yeah, and we bought our land off him and built on it.
Okay.
But he would tell us kind of, yeah, there's fairies up behind your house and that kind of thing. And I never had any kind of real experiences that I can recall there, but certainly, at night you'd hear weird stuff, kind of screaming, that kind of thing, which people used to put down to foxes.
Yeah.
Um, but they that belief, and seeing that kind of weird stuff floating around the place, it does happen. I was chatting to a, a friend where we've got a kind of a group of a few of us who are looking at I guess exploring this territory
Mhm.
together as a group, and she kind of had an assertion that the land where the land is being kind of more humanized, being more human becomes human territory. Really, it's built on. There's factories, there's all that kind of stuff there. Then the less of this stuff happens. It's more kind of in the wild. So it's really interesting to hear that kind of in a suburban environment that experience happened. Boy,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
felt my chest tighten. Christ.
Yeah. No, that was, and
Yeah,
he's much more of a believer now
yeah, I
than
can
he
imagine.
used to be, because
Yeah.
that'll do it.
Mm,
I mean, I do think it's more common in the wilder places.
mm,
And I also think, it's more common in places that have a history of it.
mm.
It's like they've been worn a little bit thin.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but I also think, you really can have these things happen and these experiences kind of anywhere.
Mm,
We were talking about banshees earlier, and I have a friend in Dublin who a couple years ago thought that they heard a banshee um, out behind their
mm.
yard. And of course, people, like you said, tend to put it down to foxes. I think anyone who's heard a fox and you're familiar enough with it
Yeah.
that when you hear something that's definitely not a fox, you know the difference.
Well,
Um,
going back to sorry to briefly cut
oh
across you.
yeah.
Going back to my dad's experience, like he's heard loads of foxes. He was just like, no, this is. He's like, he had a physical reaction to the sound, much like how you described with your
With the
husband.
music.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like absolute terror. Like truly, truly frightening.
Oh yeah, it's almost like an atavistic response because
Mm.
your brain can't process why you're afraid,
Mm.
but there's some part of you that
Mhm.
knows you need to be afraid.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's something going on that you need to
Yeah.
have some survival instincts
Yeah.
for. Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Mm.
But it's hard to put that into words.
Mm.
You know, when people hear it who didn't experience it, I understand why the instinct is to be like, well,
Yeah.
you know, maybe it was something else.
Mm.
You know, um, this is partially unrelated, but on the theme of finding explanations for
Mm.
things. Uh, 2016, so about 4 years ago now, I was staying with a group of people in Boyle. I love Boyle, by the way. I would move there today if it was possible. And there was a fence line near the building we were staying in. And I do make a habit of leaving, you know, butter and cream.
Yeah.
I'm well aware that the butter on the fence post was probably going to the hooded crows, but that's perfectly fine. That is not for me to judge. But I had gone out when we'd first gotten there, and you know, just left a little offering to sort of be like, I'm here.
Mm.
You know, let's all be good with each other. And I had told the people I was staying with
Mhm.
what I had done and where I had done it, because obviously it looks a little weird having a bit of butter on top of a fence post.
Mm.
When I went out the next morning, there was a fairy ring in the grass on top of
Wow.
a fence post. I'll send you a picture of that too.
Wow, that's
Um,
incredible.
yeah, and that's the same thing. I
Mm.
can tell people about it, but people who are skeptical, it's, you know, it was not there the night before because I will not step
Mm.
in them,
Mm.
and I'm very aware.
Mm.
And it was definitely there the next morning because then I couldn't go to the fence post because it was in front of it.
Yeah.
Um, if you're a skeptic, you'll always find an explanation.
Yeah, yeah, totally.
You know,
I mean, one of the things I always found with skeptics to a degree, is they'll rarely put their money where their mouth is. You know, it's like, well, if you don't believe this in any shape or form, why don't you recite this particular incantation at this time and see how you get on? You know, and people don't take that. They don't take that bet usually. You know, so I mean, it was interesting. I was on Gordon White's podcast about 6 7 weeks ago,
yeah,
and we were talking about this as well, and kind of he kind of framed it like that 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 really intense skepticism. Some of it is just a defense mechanism for some terrifying experience people had. They don't want to talk about,
yeah, yeah,
it's they'll maybe at hushed tones talk about something happened when they were a kid and they're just terrified and they don't want anything to do with it. Which is, I mean, to a degree, what I found out from my dad. Really,
yeah, yeah.
um, but you also found out from him is that he's a seventh child of a seventh child. So
That'll put a little concern in a person.
yeah, yeah, totally. That puts it's something else into the mix. But
Yeah,
it's one of those things as well that like he does not talk about stuff he's not comfortable talking about it.
yeah,
Occasionally, it's like an annual event. Generally when he's had a couple of drinks, he'll
yeah,
kind of he'll tell me about things that he's seen that has happened. It was like, yeah, an orb of light came in that window, went through that wall. Yeah, I see it quite regularly. Just go straight through the house. That kind
yeah,
of thing. Like that happens quite a lot. And just, but not having any kind of uh, say training or knowledge to deal with it. He's just kind of one of those people that kind of have a sensitivity and are just exposed to it all the time. Like it's fairly common, about people in Ireland. You'll always hear about that person as a gift,
yeah,
that kind of thing, but without any kind of understanding of it. I think that's the modern world, isn't it? It's the kind of like people who are
oh yeah,
exposed to these, who can see liminal spaces and see a little bit more of kind of through the veil, but have no actual training to
yeah.
deal with it. And
No context for it.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the reasons that I'm such a huge advocate for the folklore and for keeping the older beliefs
mm,
and passing them forward.
yeah,
Um, because I think it's a real shame that so much of that is being lost
mm,
because people do still have the experiences and
yeah,
people do still
yeah,
have the sensitivity to it. And these things are not going to stop happening just
Mhm.
because we've sort of decided as a wider Western cultural society
Mhm.
that skepticism is the way to go,
Mhm.
and rationality and
Mhm.
all those, catchy keywords.
Mhm.
Um, all it's really causing is that now we have all these people who have no context and no foundation to
Yeah.
understand
Yeah.
what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that's one of the really striking things that I took back from um, being in the Islamic world and the Islamic context for these things is that they do have a technology. It's called like ruqya, and they specifically um, even have like comparison tables where they lay out if this particular symbol is appearing in your patient's dreams, it's relative to this type of sorcery or it's relative to this type of jinn, and we'll talk through it. I'll send you the link to that one as well, actually, because there's probably some. Um, it's probably has some elements that could be applied to experiences with the good people.
Yeah.
It's blown my mind that there's good people possession. That's that's
Yeah.
that's something else. That really is it. Um,
Yeah, I'd
I'm
be
gonna,
curious if the symptoms with the gin possession are similar. I'll have to look into that.
I'll send you the stuff on that as well. There's a lot of stuff around. Like there's a particular you got jinn and you got like shaitan, the evil spirits.
Right.
So there's the the shaitan in particular are the idea is that they're there to move you away from the path of God. So they'll take you away from the path of Allah, and um, how that's kind of described is that they lay eggs in the human heart, and those eggs kind of hatch into um, negative personality traits, destructive personality traits. There's also kind of a concept of waswaza. Was is this idea of the whispering of demons, whispering of devils. And there's some jinn who do that, and there's some demons who do that, separate things. But the jinn element that is very similar to kind of the idea of obsession. It's like your people hearing voices. They OCD, depression. They're not able to. I mean, a lot of it actually then comes to being kind of just maybe not having great faith. They're kind of well, that's evidence of demonic possession or evidence of jinn possession if you don't believe in your faith. There's a lot of kind of those ones that are kind of like
Right.
but like so but OCD like hearing voices, memory loss, depression, anxiety, all these things that kind of start to cause internal problems, they're seen as the influence of jinn.
Gin.
Um, but,
Okay.
but certainly, it's a lot of it's related to trauma. So people will have a challenging, difficult experience, and that would be seen as kind of the entry point for the jinn. And some of these things are not necessarily overwhelmingly like total ownership of an individual, where the individual is just gone.
Yeah.
It's kind of both consciousnesses at the same time, that kind of thing. But
Interesting.
it is really interesting stuff. Um, but yeah, there's tons of it. I'll send you a lot of links to the work and see what you think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to read it.
Absolutely. But I think we'll have to do this again. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I've learned so much. You've
Oh,
really
so have I.
yeah. Well, this is why I want to do this again, because I think we can kind of continue to unpack this and find some more spaces where there's
Sure. Sure.
crossovers.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
'Cause
I'd love to. There's so much ground to cover.
I think so. Yeah, and certainly, um, I think there's something to this in that regionality and these things speaking to the local cultures through the
Mm.
symbols they understand.
Yeah.
There's something to that, and I'd love to have that conversation with you
Oh,
in
definitely.
more detail. Um, Morgan, where's the best places for people to find you on the interwebs?
Um, I try to be everywhere on the
Yeah.
interwebs. So, I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. I'm on Twitter. Um, I am on Instagram, actually.
Oh, cool.
And that's all under my name,
Yeah.
Morgan Daimler.
Mhm.
I decided early on it was easier to just
Yeah.
keep it concise.
Mm.
I have an Amazon page for my books.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pretty straightforward. If you Google my name,
Great.
I will come up.
They will all be in the show notes. So listeners, have a look at the show notes, and all those links will be listed down below. And have you got any new titles coming out?
Sadly, I always have new titles coming out because I have a obsessive compulsive writing problem. I have a book coming out in September, which is called The Raven Goddess. It's actually a follow-up to a book I wrote in 2014, I believe, about the Morrigan.
Cool.
So it's about the Irish goddess, the Morrigan. November, I have a book called Living Fairy, which is actually it's a little more esoteric in nature. It's about the potential connection between fairies and star worship.
Oh wow!
Yes, that's something I've been really digging into the last year or so. I went to Iceland with some friends and had a very intense experience there, and it got me focusing on the Pleiades in particular. But the idea of looking at
we're definitely going to have to do this again.
We definitely will. If we want to talk about that, I could definitely talk about that for a while because that's a deep subject. Yep. And then next March, I have a book, Pagan Portals Lugh, about the Irish god Lugh.
Oh, cool.
So,
awesome.
Yeah. That was a fun one to write. I did not know as much about him in particular. So I had to do a lot of research. I'm clearly not averse to research. So
awesome.
fun to dig into.
Fantastic. Well, we'll definitely have to get you back on to talk about. I really want to hear about this Iceland and the Pleiades connection. That sounds amazing. But certainly get you back on to talk Morrigan and talk Lugh. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, anytime.
Brilliant. Well, Morgan, I really appreciate your time. I've learned so much, and I'm looking forward already to having you back. That was absolutely fantastic. And
thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Well, how about that? More Jinn and fairy dots connected. This just keeps getting deeper and deeper. The rabbit hole continues to unfold. Not really sure how those metaphors work, but there you go. Thank you so much to Morgan for coming on the show, and thank you for Lonnie Scott for making the connection. All Morgan's links, you can find her on the interwebs, are below in the show notes. So knock yourselves out. She has some great titles there for you guys to explore. And obviously, from what she was saying, there are some great titles on the way. That's all from me. Thank you very much, guys, and talk soon.